My husband told me to choose between my dying mother and my marriage. He thought I'd hesitate. I didn't. 2 months later, he called me from my mother's house, and that's when he realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. I still remember how quiet the hallway was when he blocked the door. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just his hand resting against the frame, like he was holding a conversation instead of stopping me from leaving. "If you walk out," he said, calm as always, "we're done." No raised voice. No anger. That was his way. Everything measured. Everything controlled. Even ultimatums. My phone was still in my hand. The ICU nurse had just called 10 minutes earlier. My mother had been admitted suddenly. Something about her heart. They weren't sure yet. They said I should come now. I had already grabbed my coat. I remember looking past him at the door handle, like if I stared at it long enough, the situation might rearrange itself into something normal. But it didn't. "Choose right now," he added. "There are moments in life that don't feel big when you're inside them. They feel small. Almost ordinary. That was one of them." I looked at him for maybe 10 seconds. And in those 10 seconds, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted before. He wasn't asking me to choose just this once. He was asking me to confirm something that had been quietly building for years. That I would choose him. No matter what. Even over my mother. I bent down. Picked up my bag. He didn't move. I walked past him anyway. He let me. And that was the last night I lived in that house as his wife. I didn't know it then, of course. At the time, I was just focused on the hospital lights, the smell of disinfectant, and the sound of machines I couldn't quite place. My mother looked smaller in that ICU bed than I had ever seen her. She was awake, though. And when she saw me, she reached for my hand like she'd been waiting. I stayed there all night. I didn't check my phone until morning. 3 missed calls from my husband. Then nothing. No messages. No questions about my mother. Just silence. That silence stretched into days. Then weeks. And eventually, 2 months later, my phone rang again. His name on the screen. I almost didn't answer. But I did. He sounded different. Not angry. Not calm. Uncertain. "I'm at your mother's house," he said. I didn't correct him. "Not yet," he continued, like he was trying to understand something while saying it out loud. "There's a lawyer here. They're saying she left everything to you." I remember standing in my kitchen, not my old kitchen, but the small rental I had moved into after the hospital, and feeling something settle quietly inside me. Because I realized, in that moment, my mother had seen something before I did. "She left you the house too," he said. There was a long pause. And then, softer this time, "I didn't know." Neither did I. But I was starting to understand. And the strange thing is, the hardest part wasn't losing my marriage. It was realizing how long I had been slowly losing myself, long before he ever stood in that doorway. Before that night, I would have told you my marriage was stable. Not exciting. Not particularly romantic. But steady in the way people start to value more as they get older. My husband, Daniel, worked in logistics for a regional supply company. He liked systems, schedules, predictable outcomes. He was the kind of man who kept warranties in labeled folders and paid bills 3 days early. If something broke, he fixed it. If something needed planning, he planned it. There's a certain comfort in that. Especially when you've spent your younger years with uncertainty. I was working part-time at a medical billing office then. Nothing glamorous. Just quiet, repetitive work. Insurance codes, phone calls, paperwork. I liked it. It left space in my life for other things, like visiting my mother. She lived about 25 minutes away in the house I grew up in. It wasn't a large place. A single-story brick home on a quiet street where most of the neighbors had known each other for years. My mother had lived there alone since my father passed, nearly a decade earlier. She handled it well. Better than I expected, actually. She kept her routines. Morning tea by the kitchen window. Light gardening when the weather allowed. She read more than she used to. She even started volunteering at the local library twice a week. She never asked for much. That was part of why I visited often. Sometimes I'd stop by after work. Sometimes on Saturdays. Occasionally I'd bring groceries, though she'd always insist she didn't need help. We'd sit at her small kitchen table and talk about ordinary things, neighbors, recipes, news stories neither of us had strong opinions about. It wasn't dramatic, but it mattered. Daniel never said he disliked my mother. In fact, he was always polite when we visited together. He'd fix small things around her house. Replace a light fixture. Tighten a loose cabinet hinge. Once he even cleaned out her gutters without being asked. My mother appreciated that. She liked him. At least, she said she did. But there were small things. Subtle things. The kind you don't notice right away. Like how Daniel would check the time if we stayed longer than planned. Or how he'd suggest we combine visits with errands so it felt more efficient. Or the way he'd say things like, "Your mom's doing fine on her own. You don't need to worry so much." He wasn't wrong. She was doing fine. But there was something in the tone, not dismissive exactly, just practical to a fault. Daniel believed in independence. He admired people who handled their own lives without leaning on others. It was one of the things he respected about my mother, actually. He'd say, "She's strong. She doesn't expect you to drop everything." And I suppose I absorbed that over time. I started spacing my visits out a little more. Not intentionally. Just gradually. Once every few days became once a week. Once a week sometimes became every other. My mother never complained. That was her way. If she noticed the change, she didn't mention it. But I did start noticing small things during my visits. Extra groceries she hadn't mentioned needing. A loose step she said she'd been meaning to fix. The way she moved a little slower getting up from her chair. Nothing alarming. Just time moving forward. Daniel and I had our own routines too. Dinner around 7. Television afterward, usually whatever series we were halfway watching. Weekends spent running errands, cleaning, sometimes meeting friends for lunch. Comfortable. Predictable. And if I'm being honest, quiet. We didn't argue much. Some people would call that a good thing. And mostly, it was. But looking back, I realize we also didn't talk deeply very often either. We discussed logistics, plans, responsibilities. Not feelings, not fears, not the things that don't have neat solutions. Daniel preferred solvable problems. Emotions didn't fit neatly into his systems. I adapted to that. You do, after enough years. There was one moment, though, about 3 months before the ICU call, that stayed with me, even though it seemed small at the time. My mother had asked if I could come by on a Sunday afternoon. She sounded a little tired on the phone, but she brushed it off when I asked. I told Daniel I was heading over. He was sitting at the dining table, going through some paperwork. "You just saw her Wednesday," he said, without looking up. "I know. She sounded a little off today." He nodded slowly. Then he said something that didn't sound harsh, just measured. "You can't make her your responsibility." I remember pausing. "I'm not," I said. "I know," he replied calmly. "I'm just saying, these things creep up. You start adjusting your life around someone else's needs without realizing it." He wasn't accusing. He was explaining. That was Daniel's style. And I remember standing there, trying to decide why his words made me uneasy. Because on the surface, he was being reasonable. But something about the phrase adjusting your life lingered with me. Because isn't that what family does? Adjusts. Makes room. I went to see my mother anyway. We drank tea. She told me about a book she was halfway through. At one point, she pressed her hand lightly against her chest, just for a second, then kept talking. I noticed. I almost asked. But she changed the subject, and I let it go. That's one of those small decisions that doesn't seem important at the time. Until later. And sometimes I still wonder. If I had pushed a little harder that afternoon, would anything have changed? Or had the real choice already been quietly forming long before Daniel ever stood in that doorway? The call came just after 9:40 at night. I remember because Daniel and I had just finished dinner. He was rinsing his plate, and I was folding the dish towel when my phone buzzed on the counter. It wasn't a number I recognized. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail. But something, I still can't explain what, made me pick it up right away. Hello. A woman's voice. Calm. Professional. Is this Laura Bennett? Yes. This is St. Mary's Hospital. Your mother was brought in about 20 minutes ago. She's currently in the ICU. The doctors are evaluating her now, but we recommend you come as soon as possible. I remember gripping the counter. Not dramatically. Just tightening my hand around the edge, like I needed something solid. What happened? I asked. She experienced chest pain and shortness of breath. The paramedics brought her in. She's stable at the moment, but they'd like family present. Stable. That word stayed with me. Stable meant not immediate danger. But ICU meant serious. I'm coming, I said. I ended the call and turned around. Daniel was watching me now. What is it? He asked. My mom. She's in the ICU. I need to go. I didn't wait for a response. I walked toward the hallway, already thinking about grabbing my purse, my shoes, my coat. Daniel followed me. Did they say what happened? Chest pain. They're still checking. He leaned lightly against the wall as I opened the closet. What hospital? St. Mary's. That was about 30 minutes away at night. I pulled my coat down. Daniel didn't move. You're going now? He asked. I stopped for a second. Yes. They said she's stable. I know. But they told me to come. He nodded slowly, like he was processing something. You could wait until morning, he said. It wasn't confrontational. Just practical. I don't want to wait. He exhaled quietly. I just mean, if she's stable, there's not much you can do tonight. You'll just sit there. I slipped my phone into my bag. I'd rather sit there. He didn't respond right away. I walked past him toward the front door. That's when he stepped ahead of me. Not aggressively, just positioning himself between me and the exit. I remember thinking, for a brief second, that he was going to hug me, or tell me to drive safely. Instead, he rested his hand on the doorframe. You've been going over there a lot lately, he said. The shift in the conversation caught me off guard. This is different, I replied. I know, he said calmly, but this is how it starts. Emergencies turn into routines. Suddenly you're spending nights there, adjusting everything around her. I felt a small tightening in my chest. She's in the ICU, Daniel. I understand, he said, but she's stable. The repetition felt deliberate. I moved slightly, expecting him to step aside. He didn't. That's when the air in the hallway started to feel different. Not tense, exactly. Just narrower. I'm going, I said quietly. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said it. If you walk out, we're done. It wasn't loud. That made it harder to process. I actually thought I had misunderstood him. What? You heard me, he said, still calm. I'm not going to live in a marriage where everything comes second. If you walk out tonight, you're choosing that. I remember staring at him, trying to understand how we had gotten here. This isn't about choosing, I said. It is, he replied. You just don't want to call it that. My mind kept returning to the ICU, to my mother sitting under bright lights, possibly asking if I was coming, to the nurse who said, "Family present." "I need to go," I repeated. "And I need to know where I stand," he said. There was no anger in his face. That was the hardest part. He looked certain, measured, like he believed this was reasonable. And something inside me, something quiet but firm, started to shift. Because I realized this wasn't about that night. This was about every small moment before it. Every time practicality had outweighed emotion. Every time I had adjusted. I looked at him. 10 seconds, maybe. I don't remember blinking. Then I bent down, picked up my bag. He didn't move. I stepped forward anyway. For a moment, I thought he might stop me physically. But he didn't. He stepped aside just enough. I opened the door. The night air felt colder than I expected. I walked to my car, my hands slightly unsteady as I unlocked it. I didn't look back. Not once. The drive to the hospital felt longer than usual. Traffic lights seemed slower. Every red light felt personal. When I finally reached the ICU waiting area, the fluorescent lights made everything look pale and quiet. A nurse led me back after a few minutes. My mother looked smaller in the bed. Machines beside her. A faint beeping sound. But she was awake. And when she saw me, she smiled, a small, tired smile, and reached for my hand. "You came," she whispered. "Of course," I said. I sat down beside her. And for the first time since the call, my chest loosened slightly. I stayed there all night. We didn't talk much. She drifted in and out of sleep. I watched the monitor numbers without understanding them. Around 3 in the morning, she squeezed my hand again. "I'm glad you came tonight," she said softly. Something about the way she said tonight stayed with me. I nodded. I wouldn't be anywhere else. And at that moment, I realized I meant it more deeply than I had understood when I left the house. Because somewhere between Daniel's ultimatum and my mother's hand in mine, I had already made a choice I couldn't undo. I didn't go home the next day. That part happened quietly. No dramatic decision. No formal conversation. Just a series of small, practical choices. The doctor came in mid-morning and explained that my mother had experienced what he called a cardiac event. Not a full heart attack, but serious enough that they wanted to keep her under observation for a few days. They were adjusting her medication, running tests, watching her closely. "She's stable," he repeated, the same word from the night before. But now I understood how much that word could still carry. I stepped out into the hallway and finally checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Daniel. All from late the previous night. No messages. Nothing that morning. I stared at the screen longer than I expected. Part of me thought there would be at least one text, something neutral, something practical. "How is she? Let me know when you're coming home. Drive safe." But there was nothing. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and went back into my mother's room. She was awake again, watching the window. "You didn't go home?" she asked. "No. I thought I'd stay." She nodded, like she had expected that. That afternoon, I stepped out again and called Daniel. It rang 4 times before he answered. "Hi," I said. "Hi." His voice sounded normal. Calm. Not distant exactly, but measured. "She's stable," I told him. "That's good. I'm going to stay another night." There was a small pause. "Okay," he said. No argument. No questions. That almost unsettled me more. "I'll call you later," I said. "All right." We hung up. The conversation lasted less than a minute. That night, I slept in the hospital chair beside my mother's bed. The room hummed softly with machines, footsteps in the hallway, occasional murmured voices from nurses changing shifts. Around midnight, my mother woke up. She looked at me carefully. "You and Daniel okay?" she asked. The question caught me off guard. Why do you ask? She hesitated slightly. I don't know, just a feeling. I smiled faintly. We're fine. She nodded, but she didn't look entirely convinced. My mother had always been observant in quiet ways. She didn't ask many questions, but she noticed tone, pauses, the things people didn't say. She reached for my hand again. I'm glad you came, she said. I squeezed her fingers gently. I told you. I wouldn't be anywhere else. But as I sat there, I realized I still hadn't told her what had happened at the door. I wasn't sure why. Maybe because saying it out loud would make it more real. Or maybe because I wasn't ready to understand what it meant yet. She was discharged 3 days later. Not fully recovered, but stable enough to go home with medication and follow-up appointments. The doctor recommended she not stay alone the first few days. So I went with her. Again, it wasn't dramatic. I packed a small overnight bag. Texted my office that I'd be out for a few days. Called Daniel briefly to tell him I'd be staying with my mother. Okay, he said. That was it. No, I miss you. No, when will you be back? Just quiet acceptance. The first night back at my mother's house felt familiar and strange at the same time. I slept in my old bedroom. The same pale curtains. The same bookshelf with novels I hadn't touched in years. My mother moved slowly but steadily around the kitchen the next morning, insisting on making tea herself. You don't need to hover, she told me gently. I know. But I stayed nearby anyway. Over the next few days, we fell into a soft routine. Medication in the morning. Short walks down the driveway. Doctor follow-up calls. She seemed stronger each day. And yet, something had shifted. I found myself noticing small things more sharply. The quiet of the house. The way she paused before climbing stairs. How carefully she measured out her pills. Time felt more visible somehow. On the 4th evening, we sat at the kitchen table after dinner. She watched me for a moment. You don't have to stay this long, she said. I want to. She nodded slowly. Then she said something that stayed with me. Sometimes you don't realize what matters most until something interrupts everything. I didn't respond right away. Because I knew she wasn't just talking about her heart. I didn't return home for almost 2 weeks. Not intentionally. Just one day turned into another. Daniel and I spoke briefly every few days. Short conversations. Polite. Practical. How's she doing? Better. When are you coming back? Soon. But soon never quite arrived. Eventually, I went back to our house to pick up more clothes. It felt different. Not hostile. Not broken. Just quiet. Daniel was at work when I arrived. The house looked the same. Nothing moved. Nothing out of place. But I noticed something small. The spare room door was open. Daniel had set up his laptop there. Work papers on the desk. A blanket folded neatly on the bed. It looked like he'd been sleeping there. I stood in the doorway longer than I meant to. It wasn't dramatic. Just a quiet confirmation. He had accepted the distance. Or maybe he had created it. I packed another bag and left. That night, my mother asked how things were at home. I hesitated. Then, for the first time, I told her about the doorway. The ultimatum. The choice. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. You did the right thing, she said softly. I felt something tighten in my throat. I didn't think it would change things this much. She nodded slowly. Sometimes the moment that looks small is the one that shows you everything. A week later, she had another episode. Not as severe, but enough to return to the hospital. That time, she stayed 5 days. I didn't leave her side. And somewhere during those long hours, sitting beside her bed, listening to the steady rhythm of machines. I started to understand something I hadn't wanted to face. Daniel hadn't called once. Not during those 5 days. Not to ask how she was. Not to ask how I was. Just silence again. And I don't know when exactly it happened, but somewhere between the second night and the fourth morning, I realized my marriage might already be over, even if no one had officially said it yet. My mother passed 3 weeks later. Quietly. Early morning. I was holding her hand when it happened. There wasn't a dramatic moment. Just the machine changing tone. A nurse stepping in. Soft voices. And then, stillness. I remember sitting there for a long time afterward. Not crying right away. Just absorbing the absence. If you've ever lost someone like that, quietly, without chaos, you know how strange it feels. Like the world didn't quite notice something enormous just happened. And I think that's when I felt the lowest. Because I realized I had lost 2 things at once. My mother. And the marriage I had believed would always be there. 2 days after the funeral, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer. But I did. Hello. Ms. Bennett. This is Karen Wallace. I'm calling from Wallace and Green Law offices. Your mother listed you as her primary contact regarding her estate. We'd like to schedule a meeting. I frowned slightly. My mother didn't really have much, I said. There was a small pause. Well, she made some updates recently. It would be best if we discussed them in person. Something about her tone made me sit up a little straighter. Okay, I said quietly. And as I ended the call, I had the strange feeling that my mother had left behind more than memories. I just didn't know yet how much she had seen before I did. I met the lawyer 4 days later. By then, the house felt different. My mother's house, I mean. Not empty exactly, but paused. Her mug was still beside the sink. Her reading glasses folded neatly on the side table. The small calendar on the fridge still marked with her neat handwriting. I hadn't moved anything. Part of me didn't want to. The meeting was scheduled at her office downtown, a quiet building with carpeted hallways and muted lighting. The kind of place where voices naturally lower without anyone asking. Karen Wallace greeted me in the reception area. She was in her early 60s, composed, kind without being overly warm. She shook my hand gently, like she understood why I was there. I'm very sorry for your loss, she said. Thank you. She led me into a small conference room and set a folder in front of me. Your mother updated her will about 6 weeks ago, she explained. 6 weeks. I did the math in my head. That was shortly after the Sunday afternoon when she pressed her hand to her chest at the kitchen table. The detail landed quietly. She wanted to make sure everything was clear, Karen continued. She was very organized. That sounded like my mother. Careful, thoughtful, quietly prepared. Karen opened the folder. Your mother left all of her assets to you. The house, her savings, her retirement account, and a small life insurance policy. I nodded slowly. None of that surprised me. I was her only child. But then Karen added something else. She also left a written letter to be given to you during this meeting. She slid a sealed envelope across the table. My name written in my mother's handwriting. I stared at it for a moment before opening it. The paper inside was simple. Just 1 page. Her handwriting steady, familiar. Laura. If you're reading this, then things probably didn't go the way either of us hoped. I know you. You try to hold everything together. You try to keep peace, even when it costs you more than you admit. I don't want you to feel tied to anything that makes you smaller. This house is yours. Not just legally, but in the way I always intended. A place where you never have to ask permission to belong. You've spent a lot of your life adjusting for other people. I hope this gives you something steady, no matter what happens. And one more thing, I noticed more than you thought I did. I just wanted you to know. I was proud of you for coming that night. Love, Mom. I read the letter twice. Then a third time. The room felt very still. Karen gave me space. She didn't interrupt. Eventually, I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She signed the house over entirely. I asked quietly. Yes, Karen confirmed. It's solely in your name. Free and clear. Free and clear. The phrase settled in my mind. No mortgage. No shared ownership. Just mine. I nodded slowly. Then Karen asked something gently. Are you currently living there? Yes. Then you won't need to move or make any immediate decisions. Everything transfers directly. I exhaled softly, because I realized, for the first time in weeks, I wasn't unsure about where I would sleep that night. There's a strange comfort in that. After the meeting, I walked back to my car slowly. The air felt different. Lighter, maybe, but not happy. Just steadier. When I got home, I sat at the same kitchen table where my mother and I had spent so many quiet afternoons. Her letter still in my hand. And that's when I thought about Daniel. Not emotionally, not angrily, just practically. Because technically, Daniel didn't know any of this yet. And in truth, I hadn't spoken to him since the funeral. He had attended briefly, stood near the back, offered a polite hug, then left early. We hadn't discussed anything after. No separation conversation. No decisions. Just distance. I assumed he was still at our house. Still living the same routine. But that assumption didn't last long. 2 days later, my phone rang. Daniel's name on the screen. I hesitated before answering. Hello. He sounded uncertain. Not his usual measured tone. Hey. I'm at your mom's place. I sat up slightly. At the house? Yeah. I frowned. How did you get in? The spare key. You gave me one a while back, remember? I did remember. He had used it once before to fix her kitchen sink. What are you doing there? I asked. He hesitated. I thought it might be easier if I stayed here for a bit. The words landed quietly. You moved in. I asked. Just temporarily, he said quickly. I figured you wouldn't mind. There's more space here. And you've been staying anyway. I looked around the kitchen slowly. The chair across from me. The hallway leading to the bedrooms. Something inside me shifted again. Not anger. Just clarity. Because Daniel hadn't asked. He had assumed. And maybe, months earlier, I would have accepted that without thinking. But now, after the letter, after everything, it felt different. I didn't respond right away. He continued. There's also someone here. A lawyer, I think. She said something about paperwork. Karen. My grip tightened slightly on the phone. She's saying the house is in your name, he added quietly. I leaned back in the chair. Yes, I said calmly. There was a pause. Longer this time. I didn't realize, he said. I didn't either. Until a few days ago. Another silence. And in that quiet, I realized something important. For the first time since that night in the hallway, I wasn't reacting. I was deciding. Because the truth was, Daniel standing in that doorway had forced a choice. But now, this moment offered another one. Not about anger. Not about revenge. Just about boundaries. About what belonged to me. And what didn't anymore. Some people believe that when someone hurts you, the right response is to forgive immediately. Others believe you should close the door completely. I'm not sure there's one correct answer. But sitting there, holding my mother's letter, listening to Daniel breathing quietly on the other end of the phone, I realized I finally understood something she had written. A place where you never have to ask permission to belong. And I knew, whatever happened next, I wasn't going to give that feeling away again. Do you want me to leave? Daniel asked. The question surprised me. Not because of the words, but because of the tone. For the first time in a long time, he didn't sound certain. I looked around the kitchen again. The late afternoon light was coming through the same window where my mother used to sit with her tea. The house still smelled faintly like the lavender cleaner she preferred. I thought about her letter. A place where you never have to ask permission to belong. No, I said calmly. Not right this second. He exhaled softly. I just thought, since things were already complicated, this might make it easier. For who? I asked. There was a small pause. I didn't mean it like that, he said. I know. And I did. Daniel wasn't trying to manipulate the situation in an obvious way. He was doing what he always did, solving a practical problem. He needed somewhere to stay. The house was available. He made a decision. But this wasn't just practical anymore. I'll come by later, I said. Okay. We hung up. The drive over felt shorter than usual. Maybe because I wasn't anxious this time. Just focused. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel's car was already there. I sat in my car for a moment before getting out. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. Same trimmed bushes. Same wind chime near the porch that moved gently when the air shifted. But stepping up to the door felt different. I unlocked it. Daniel was standing in the living room. He looked tired. Not disheveled. Just worn in a quiet way. Like he hadn't slept well. Hi, he said. Hi. The air between us wasn't hostile. Just unfamiliar. I noticed a small overnight bag near the couch. His laptop on the coffee table. A mug in the kitchen sink. He had settled in. Not fully, but enough. I didn't move anything, he said, as if anticipating my thoughts. I see. We stood there for a moment. Then he said something that felt closer to the surface than anything before. I didn't think you'd stay away this long. I nodded slightly. I didn't either. Silence again. Shorter this time. I'm sorry about your mom, he added. Thank you. His eyes moved around the room, then back to me. I know things got complicated. I watched him carefully. This was the closest he had come to acknowledging the doorway. But he didn't mention it directly. And I realized something important. Daniel wasn't avoiding it intentionally. He simply saw it differently. To him, that moment had been a boundary. To me, it had been a fracture. I met with the lawyer, I said. He nodded. She explained the house is fully yours. Yes. Another pause. Then he said quietly, I didn't expect that. I know. He shifted his weight slightly. I figured, since we're still married, we'd sort things out together. There it was. Not aggressive. Just assumed. And I felt something settle inside me again. Daniel, I said gently, we haven't really been living together for almost 2 months. I know. But that doesn't necessarily mean. You told me if I walked out, we were done. The words hung in the room. He didn't respond immediately. I said that in the moment, he replied finally. I understand. But you still walked out. Yes. Another silence. He looked down briefly. Then back at me. I didn't think you'd take it that literally. I nodded slowly. That sentence told me everything I needed to know. Because for me, there had been nothing figurative about it. You blocked the door, Daniel, I said quietly. He didn't deny it. I needed to know where I stood, he said. And I needed to see my mother. Neither of us raised our voices. That wasn't our style. but the clarity between us was sharper than any argument. He glanced toward the hallway. I wasn't trying to push you away.
I know.
And I wasn't trying to control you. I hesitated slightly. I don't think you saw it that way. He didn't respond. That was enough. We stood there a few seconds longer. Then I said, calmly, I think it's best if you find another place to stay. He looked at me, not shocked, just absorbing. You're asking me to leave?
Yes.
He exhaled slowly. This soon? I think it's clearer that way. There was another long pause. This is the part where some people might think I was being harsh, or moving too quickly. I understand that. Even standing there, I felt the weight of the decision. Years of marriage, shared routines, familiar silence, all narrowing into this quiet conversation. But I also remembered the hallway, the door, the 10 seconds. And I knew I couldn't step backward into something that had already shifted. Daniel nodded slowly. All right, he said. No argument. No raised voice. He walked to the couch, picked up his bag, and began placing a few things inside. The movements were slow, measured, just like everything else about him. When he finished, he looked around once more. I'll come back for the rest later, he said. That's fine. He moved toward the door, then paused. Laura, he said quietly.
Yes.
I didn't expect things to end like this. I nodded.
Neither did I.
He opened the door, stepped outside, and left. The house grew quiet again, but this time, the silence felt different. Not empty, just settled. I stood there for a few moments, listening to the wind chime outside. And for the first time since that night in the hallway, I realized the choice I made hadn't just been about my mother. It had been about who I was willing to become. And once you see that clearly, there's no going back. The first night alone in my mother's house felt heavier than I expected. Not because Daniel had left, and not even because my mother was gone. It was the quiet. A different kind of quiet than before. When my mother lived there, the silence always felt occupied. There was always the sense that she was in another room, turning a page, boiling water, moving slowly down the hallway. Now, the quiet felt wider. I walked through the house that evening without turning on many lights. Just the kitchen lamp. The one she used every night. I made tea the way she did, too hot at first, then waiting for it to cool slightly before taking the first sip. I sat in her chair without thinking, then noticed it, and stayed there anyway. Grief doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it settles into small routines. I returned to work the following week. My office felt the same, ringing phones, paperwork, muted conversations. People offered condolences, gentle voices, careful expressions. I appreciated it, but I also noticed something else. I felt steadier than I expected. Not happy, not relieved, just grounded. Like something inside me had shifted into a quieter, more stable place. Daniel texted 2 days after he left. Just a short message. I'll stop by Saturday to pick up the rest. I replied, that's fine. Saturday morning, he arrived right on time. That was Daniel's way. Predictable. Reliable. I was in the kitchen when he knocked. I opened the door. Hi, he said.
Hi.
He moved inside quietly, heading toward the hallway. He packed efficiently, clothes, laptop, a few personal items. No unnecessary conversation. At one point, he paused in the living room. I fixed the loose hinge on the cabinet, he said. I looked over. Thank you. It was such a small, familiar gesture. And for a moment, I felt the weight of what we were losing. Not dramatic love, not loud affection, but the quiet ways two people learn to take care of shared space. He finished packing, carried his bag to the door, then stopped. I spoke to a lawyer, he said. I nodded. That's probably wise. We'll need to figure out next steps.
Yes.
He hesitated. I don't want this to become difficult. I don't either. And I meant it. Because despite everything, Daniel hadn't been cruel. Controlling, maybe. Rigid, yes. But not malicious. Sometimes relationships don't break because of one terrible act. Sometimes they just reveal themselves. He nodded. I'll be in touch.
Okay.
He left again. That was the last time he stood inside the house. The weeks that followed moved slowly. Paperwork, bank notifications, utility transfers, practical things. Grief came in waves. Some mornings I'd wake up expecting to call my mother. Then remember. Some evenings I'd find myself reaching for my phone to tell Daniel something small, a news story, a repair I'd made, a grocery list. Then stop. Because those habits take time to loosen. I started walking in the evenings. Just around the neighborhood. The same streets I walked as a teenager. Some houses looked unchanged. Others had new paint, new cars, different families. Life moves forward quietly, whether you're ready or not. One afternoon, about a month later, I found myself sorting through my mother's desk. Old letters, bills, photographs, and tucked in the back of a drawer, I found something small. A notebook. Not a diary. Just a simple spiral notebook with occasional entries. Grocery lists. Reminders. Doctor appointments. But on one page, there was a short note in her handwriting. Just one sentence. Laura deserves a place where she feels safe to choose. No date. No explanation. I sat there for a long time holding that notebook. Because I realized she hadn't just reacted to the situation. She had been watching, understanding, quietly preparing. And I wondered how many small things she had noticed that I hadn't. About 2 months after Daniel moved out, the separation paperwork began. It was straightforward. No major disputes. We divided our shared accounts. Personal belongings. Practical things. At one point, our lawyers suggested mediation, but we didn't need much of it. Daniel remained calm. Predictable. Even at the end. The final documents arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. I signed them at my kitchen table. The same table where my mother and I used to sit. The same table where I had read her letter. There was something fitting about that. When I finished, I set the pen down slowly. And sat there for a while. Because endings don't always feel like endings. Sometimes they just feel quiet. Later that evening, I walked outside and sat on the porch. The wind chime moved gently again. I had started noticing small things more. The sound of birds in the late afternoon. The way sunlight moved across the driveway. The rhythm of the neighborhood. I thought about the hallway. The door. The 10 seconds. And I wondered, if I was standing there now, would I make the same choice? I think I would. But I also understand now how difficult those moments can be. Because sometimes you don't know you're choosing your future until it's already happening. If you've ever faced a decision like that, one that quietly reshapes everything, you probably understand how complicated it feels. There's no applause. No clear right answer. Just a path you start walking, and only later realize how much it changed you. It's been 3 years now. The house feels different again. Not empty. Not paused. Lived in. I repainted the kitchen last spring. Planted new flowers along the walkway. The wind chime is still there. I never moved it. Some evenings, I still sit by the window with tea the way my mother used to. Not because I'm trying to hold on to the past. Just because it feels right. Daniel and I don't speak anymore, but the separation remained quiet, just like everything else between us. I heard through a mutual friend that he relocated for work. That didn't surprise me. Daniel always preferred fresh systems when things became complicated. I don't feel anger when I think about him now. Just clarity. Because looking back, I don't think he expected me to leave that night. Not really. He expected me to adjust. To wait. To choose stability over urgency. And for a long time, that's probably what I would have done. But something about that moment, the doorway, the ICU call, the silence afterward, it showed me how easily you can lose pieces of yourself while still believing everything is fine. And sometimes, it takes a crisis to show you what you've been slowly accepting. I still keep my mother's letter in the same drawer near the kitchen. Every once in a while, I take it out and read the line she wrote. A place where you never have to ask permission to belong. It's a simple sentence. But it changed how I see everything. Because in the end, the choice wasn't just between my mother and my marriage. It was between staying quiet or stepping into a life where my voice mattered. And I still think about that sometimes. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been given a choice that didn't look big at the time, but later you realized it shaped everything that came after? So that's my story, folks. If it resonated with you, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know how far Kimura's voice travels. Sometimes choosing compassion for someone else is the moment you finally choose dignity for yourself.